Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. We're getting into a really fascinating and honestly super counterintuitive theological paradox today. It's this idea that to actually be built up, you first have to be completely broken down, right? It sounds backwards. The sources we're looking at argue that instead of God just building on top of our human capabilities, his sovereignty actually requires the absolute dismantling of our self-reliance. It's like clearing the canvas, so to speak. So let's dive into exactly how this process of breaking and restoration really works.
To set the stage for us, check out these powerful lyrics from a song called Unbreakable Covenant that's heavily featured in our source material. It says, "You break our strength, you shatter our pride, a hollow vessel with nothing left inside." This is essentially the emotional and thematic anchor for everything we're going to talk about today. You see, the breaking described here, it's not an accident. It's framed as a totally deliberate, purposeful act of becoming a hollow vessel. Keep that specific image of an emptied vessel in your head as we keep going.
All right, here is our quick roadmap. First, we'll define what this shattering of the ego really means. Then we'll explore three distinct case studies: Abraham, Rahab, and Peter. And finally, we'll compare their transformations to see what this tells us about the ultimate role of God's sovereignty.
So moving right into section 1, the shattering of the ego and the beginning of grace.
Our source material really zeroes in on this concept of pashwe. It's a Korean word that translates to a deliberate breaking or shattering. And the crucial thing to understand here is that this isn't some random punishment, not at all. It's the intentional clearing out of human self-reliance, self-righteousness, and pride. The text actually points to Isaiah 64:6, noting that our own human righteousness is, well, effectively meaningless. God tears down human will and arrogance to create a void. And why do that? Because, as Philippians 3:9 suggests, he needs to pour his own faith and righteousness into that empty space. It is absolutely necessary preparation. Think about it. You literally cannot fill a cup that is already full of itself, right?
Which brings us to section 2, Abraham laying down his human strength.
Let's take Abraham, the patriarch of the faith. Naturally, he wanted to produce an heir using his own physical capability, right? He was trying to fulfill a divine promise, but on his own human timeline. But look at what God does. He deliberately waits until Abraham is 99 years old. He waits until Abraham's body is essentially dead when it comes to reproductive capability. God pushed him to the absolute edge of his human ability so that his self-reliance was totally and completely shattered. The covenant was only fulfilled when Abraham's human contribution hit absolute zero.
And, this isn't just an isolated incident for one guy. The text connects Abraham's experience directly to the Israelites wandering in the wilderness. Deuteronomy 8:2 explicitly states that God led them through the desert specifically to humble them. Those 40 years out there, that wasn't a punishment for bad navigation. It was a deliberate structural breaking ground. God humbled his people, even letting them hunger, so they would finally recognize their own profound weakness. Breaking that illusion of self-sufficiency is a consistent, non-negotiable prerequisite for the people of the covenant.
All right, section 3, Rahab abandoning her worldly courage.
This example is fantastic because it perfectly illustrates how this principle applies even to a total outsider. Rahab was a survivor living in Jericho, and she relied entirely on her own worldly boldness and street smarts. But watch what happens. Her natural courage is completely dissolved. The source points to texts like Psalm 89 and Joshua 2, showing that God's intervention caused her heart to literally melt in fear when she heard about his power. She had to abandon all her worldly defenses, her entire human shield, so that she could trust entirely in a divine covenant instead of just trusting in herself.
Now for section 4, Peter's false confidence getting broken. So we've seen a patriarch, we've seen an outsider. Now let's look at Peter. This is the guy from the absolute inner circle. Peter loudly boasted that he would rather die than abandon Jesus, relying totally on his own emotional willpower and fierce loyalty. But what happens when he's faced with actual life-threatening danger by a campfire? That self-reliance catastrophically fails. To save his own skin, he denies Jesus 3 times. His pride was just utterly dismantled.
If we trace this ego collapse on a timeline, it is wild how incredibly fast it happens. Step 1, the boast in Mark 14, relying purely on human courage. Step 2, the 3 denials. Out there in the courtyard, under real pressure, his human strength just evaporates. And step 3, the rooster crows. The text highlights Peter's bitter weeping. That weeping, that is the devastating realization of pashwara, that shuddering we talked about. The entire illusion of being the spiritual hero is destroyed, and it leaves behind only the stark reality of his profound human weakness.
Let's move to Section 5, comparing these transformations and looking at the role of God's sovereignty.
When we actually compare these three figures side by side, the pattern is just undeniable. Abraham had to lose his physical capability, Rahab had to lose her worldly courage, and Peter had to lose his boastful confidence. Think about how different they are: a patriarch, a Canaanite survivor, and a lead disciple. Yet their transformation process is exactly the same. The breaking of the ego is the universal prerequisite here. It was only when their specific, unique human strengths hit absolute zero that they were able to experience total reliance, unmerited grace, and God's restored power.
And this brings us to a really beautiful, deeply humbling theological conclusion drawn from 2 Corinthians 4:7. The source insists that human beings are, at the end of the day, merely jars of clay. We are fragile. We are breakable vessels meant to hold a divine treasure. The power belongs entirely to God, not to us. We aren't the heroes of the faith, we are just witnesses to God's sovereign power. By breaking our egos, God ensures that the glory and the capability are clearly recognized as His alone.
But that raises a big question. What actually happens to those who just refuse to be humbled? Well, the source provides a pretty stark warning. Think about the builders of the Tower of Babel. They refused to humble themselves, actively building a massive monument to their own strength just to defy God. And the result? God scattered them completely. Or take the Amorites. They relied on their worldly defenses, literally living in what was known as an iron fortress. Relying on a human-made iron fortress against God, that only invites destruction, and God dismantled them entirely. The takeaway is clear. Resisting this humbling process only leads to ruin.
So, bringing this full circle back to the lyrics we started with, by your covenant alone, by your sovereign hand enthroned. The source firmly argues that the life of faith is built purely by God's sovereign hand. It is absolutely not built by human effort, good character, or some adventurous spirit. Claiming otherwise is just rooted in humanism and pride. Like Philippians 2:5 suggests, true humility isn't even something we can somehow achieve on our own. It requires taking on the mind of Christ, and that only happens after our own human will is broken.
Which leaves us with a really deeply personal takeaway from today's explainer. The source challenges us with this provocative question. What iron fortress remains unbroken within me? Seriously, think about it. Where are you still acting like Abraham at 80, trying to force a human solution? Where might you be boasting like Peter, relying on your own willpower instead of just resting in grace? Take a moment to reflect on your own unbroken egos and your reliance on human strength. Because as we've seen today, true grace only enters when the fortress finally falls. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning what you are building your foundations on.